I bet you guys that at some point or another, you were stuck with the dilemma. Should I send my email from the back end or the front end? Well, there may be pros and cons to both approaches, but in this video, we're going to highlight exactly how we can do that through the front end using the Node Mailer package. With that being said, let's get it cracking. I've started a Discord server, guys, that you can join to sort of follow these videos as well as future crash course videos. And we're going to be having a few challenges in there as well, some code challenges, and also just kind of like getting along and just joining the community and chatting with others. So the link is in the description of this video if you guys want to join that Discord server. You might want to jump on that before I decide to lock it down and make it a private server. So let's go ahead and move on to this now. So what I have here is a basic form. And this contact us form has several fields, as I mentioned before: first name, last name, email, and message. So what is going to happen is when I submit this form, it's going to automatically send an email to the admin user using the Node Mailer package for Node.js. Now, I will have this installed in my Next.js project, which we're going to build together. Let me just kind of demo exactly what will happen here. So it's a basic form. I'm just going to populate a first name of Ron, last name of Buchanan, email, I'll make that test@example.com, and then here I'll write this is a test message. So just a basic form here. Now again, I have an event handler that when I click this send message button, it's going to automatically fire off the code, and as you guys can see above, it's saying here we have like an alert message saying that the inquiry has been submitted. So now if I go to my email inbox, which I'm using Google Workspace, if I click on that, you guys will see that we have the form submission here. Now to make this actually happen, there are many different ways that we can populate the data within this template, because essentially all this email is a template. It's an HTML template. And there's many ways to do that, but the way I'm going to use is I'm going to kind of show you guys using just code with no additional packages how to populate these dynamic values into this HTML template. So without further ado, let's jump into Visual Studio Code and set up our Next.js project. So here I have my Visual Studio open, and so far I have nothing in this folder. I created a brand new folder called Node Mailer Tutorial, or Node Mailer Tutorial. You can call it anything you want, it doesn't really matter. But basically what we're going to do here is we're going to set up a brand new Next.js 14 project, version 14. Now in the future it may be a different version, so you just might want to look at Next.js's documentation to see exactly what code you'll need to run. But you need to make sure you have Node.js installed, guys, and I'll leave a link in the description of this video so that way you guys can install Node.js as well, because that is a dependency package. So once you have Node.js installed, you can confirm that by typing here node -- version. And right now you guys will see I'm using version 21.1.0. So any version like that, or even lower, or even higher would suffice. I think for Next.js 14 you want to have at least version 21 though. All right, so let me just clear this out by typing clear and hitting enter. And so the first command we're going to run is to create a brand new Next.js project, and that's going to be npx space create -next-app @ space dot or period. And that's basically going to create a brand new Next.js project in the current directory. So I'll hit enter. And what we should get once this loads, we should get a list of, rather a wizard of questions. So I'm just going to accept all the defaults here. So I do not want TypeScript. I do not want ESLinter. I do want Tailwind CSS for quick styling. I don't want the source directory. I do want the app router, which is the new app folder or app directory in Next.js 13 plus. And I do not want that. I'll hit enter. And here on the left, you'll see that we have our brand new folder structure. So before we delve into these folders, we're not going to delve in too deeply. I've done that in my past videos. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add a new folder. So I'm just going to make sure I click on the outside of that tree structure. I'm just going to click this icon here to add a new folder, because I'm going to add a folder called emails. Now this emails folder is going to have a couple of files, and essentially it's going to be the files that are specific to this Node Mailer package that we'll be working with. So I'm going to just highlight the emails folder that I just created. I'm going to click the new file icon, and I'm going to create a file called client.js. .js standing for JavaScript, because this is going to be the client that's going to load our node mailer instance, and then from this client we'll be able to utilize that node mailer instance anywhere in our application, right? And then let's see, I think we'll add one more file here. Not sure what happened there. Let me just click it here again to select. We're going to add one more file, and this file here is going to be called contact-form.html. All right, make sure it's not .js, it's .html, and this is basically going to be the HTML template for our email, what we saw earlier in the demo. So let me just make sure that these are open and we're good to go. Now, next up, let's expand the app folder, which is in our root directory. And basically, this is Next.js's newest way of working with components within the application. So there's a few things I want to change here. Here we have this layout.js. I typically like to rename my React or Next.js components as .jsx, or if I'm using TypeScript, .tsx. So let me just highlight this. I'm just going to change the name of this, and I'm going to just type an X at the end to rename this to layout.jsx. Now we also should have here a page.js file, which is our main homepage file. I'm just going to hit enter there and type an X to change that to page.jsx. You don't have to do this. This is just my own personal preference. So let's see. I think the first thing we can do, we're in this page.jsx file. Now generally this file is the homepage of a Next.js project. I'm just going to get rid of all this code here. I'm just going to highlight and hit the backspace or delete key, and I'm going to create a brand new Next.js component. Now I have a short key because I have a package installed, and I mentioned this in my prior videos, and I can leave the link in the description below. But basically this extension for Visual Studio allows me to quickly create React or Next.js components. So I'm just going to rename this to homepage, and I'm going to save by hitting Command S. Right, so that's what we have so far. So far, so good. So in this file, we're not going to do anything else for right now. I'm just setting this up so that way we can come back later and populate everything we need to populate. So for now, let's just open up our layout.jsx. So there are two ways I can do this. I can either just go directly to this tree here, but what I typically like to do to work a lot faster is I like to hold the Command key on a Mac. On a Windows, I believe it's the Control key, and then type the P key. That's going to open up this file search, and I can type in here layout.jsx just to make things go a lot quicker. Now, if you guys haven't seen my prior videos, I suggest you definitely go and see them, and make sure you subscribe to this channel, hit the bell icon for future updates. But basically, what I typically like to do is work with the layout.jsx file first, because this file serves as our sort of container. So anything that we change in this file can be shown on any page of our application. So I'm not really going to change much for the purpose of this tutorial here. What I'm going to change here, I'm going to come down here, and let's see, what do I want to do? What I'm going to do here is this, we have this root layout component. I'm just going to take this part here, this children prop. I'm going to make a new line here, and I'm going to add a main HTML tag like this, and just paste that children within this. And the reason why I'm doing that is so that I can add a container around this component. So I'm just going to say class name, and we're going to set that to container. Now, by default, Next.js and Tailwind CSS has container styling. But what I want you guys to do is to look in the video description of this, the description of this video, because I want you guys to copy the HTML that I'm about to copy and paste, because I don't want to spend time working with the HTML, or rather the styling, the CSS styling. So I'm just going to copy some here, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come back to this file structure here, and I'm going to open up our globals.css file, which is right here, right above it. So let me open that up, and in our global CSS, you'll see we have some predefined styles. And at the very top, the first 3 lines are our Tailwind directives. We're just going to leave that intact. We're not going to touch those I'm just going to get rid of all the code below that like this. Okay. So far, so good. And what I'm going to do here is, if you look in the video description for the GitHub repo, if you look within the app folder, you should see all this code that I'm talking about. So go ahead and copy that CSS code. You can copy the entire globals.css file and then just paste it in like that. All right. And just to quickly kind of go over what's in here, scrolling all the way up to the top, we just basically have some Tailwind styling broken down into various layers. In fact, I think I copied a little bit too much here. Let me just get rid of these 3 lines like that. Cool. So yeah, we basically have some Tailwind CSS styling here. Based on layers, we define a base layer which has the defined tags, HTML tags, and we're just putting various styles here. And within the components layer, we can define specific custom classes as selectors that we can use on our elements. So I'm basically doing that. I'm using pure Tailwind here. And if you guys are not familiar with how Tailwind works, you might want to look at a couple of my other videos in which Tailwind is being used, just to kind of help you come up to speed. So that's pretty much it for the globals.css file. Let me just kind of quickly go back to our layout.jsx file that we had open here. And I think that's all we need here, just this container. So I think, if anything, we can come back to it later on if we need something else. All right, so I'll just close out of that. Now, the next thing that I want to do, guys, is I want to install the node mailer package, because otherwise this stuff will not work without it. So I'm just going to come here to the bottom right, and I'm just going to click on this plus icon. And that's going to open up a brand new terminal tab. So then I'm just going to clear this out. And I'm in the current directory where I want this package to be installed. So I'm going to type here npmi, which is Node Package Manager. And then the name of the package is Node Mailer, all in one word like that, and hit enter. And that's going to install our Node Mailer package. And again, what this package allows us to do is to send emails through our front end application. So now there's no need for us to build a separate backend using Express or something like Django or Flask. We could just simply send that email from our front end Node.js application, which is definitely built using Next.js. All right, so it looks like we're good there. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do, let me just kind of close out of there. It looks like we have some unsaved changes. Let's go back to page.jsx. I'll hit Command S to save for now, and we're good to go. I'm just going to close these tabs so we don't get confused. All right, guys, so the next thing I want to do here is I'm going to open up this client.js file here that's within our emails folder. As you know, we created this earlier, and it's currently empty. So what I want to do now, guys, is I want to start working with the Node Mailer client, because what we'll need to do is to set up some default code here, some boilerplate code that we can use to instantiate the Node Mailer object. But now that I think about it, one thing I need to do is, when we're working with email and we're working with the various credentials, we'll need to have a way to store the email password, as well as to store some other values that we may need as part of our configuration. Now, obviously, we don't want to expose that information to the average user. So what we should have in here is a .env file to store environment variables. And environment variables are basically ways that we can install, or rather that we can leverage various values within an application without exposing the data directly to the front-end client, whether it's a browser or some other type of user agent. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have this .env file within our root directory of our project. So I'm going to come out here and just click this new file icon, and I'm going to type in here .env like that and hit enter. Now in here, we're going to define several different environment variables that we'll leverage in our application. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type out the names of these environment variables, guys, and I'll just set some dummy values, and at some point we'll skip ahead in the video because I don't want to expose that here for you guys, because you don't need to see that. But it will just go ahead and define the variables, and then offline you guys can populate it with what you need to, whatever values you need to set. So the first environment variable that we'll set here is going to be one for the admin email address that we'll be using, because the admin's email will be the one that will send send the actual email to the user. In this case, essentially, we're going to be using the admin email to send an email to the admin. So we're basically sending an email to ourselves. Now, whenever we define an environment variable in Next.js, we can expose that value to both the server side as well as the client side. And we can do that by using the next_public prefix in front of the environment variable name. So let's type here next_public_admin_email, because that's the one that we want to set. Now, again, as I mentioned, I'm not going to actually populate real values here. Let's just kind of set a dummy value as text. Now let's use a different one. Let's say admin at example.com. Okay. Now this is obviously not a real email address. I'm just setting that so that way you guys don't see the actual credentials that I'm going to be using, right? But essentially what you'll want to do is you want to put your own email address, whatever mail server you'll be using, whether you'll be using Gmail or Microsoft 365. You just want to look up the SMTP settings as well as understanding what your email address is, and then populate these values here, okay? So the next one here, we want to basically have an environment variable that would represent the full signature line. And I'll explain what I mean in a second. So I'm just going to say next public, let's call it admin email underscore full. So basically just adding the underscore full to this one. And what I'm going to do here is, let's say that this is going to be called test sender. And then in here, I'm going to populate the same email address, admin at example.com. Now, basically what I did here is, let me just put let's make sure we have a space after sender or whatever name you use. Now here you can use whatever name you want, but basically this name test sender is the name that would show up in your email, right? So for example, if I go back here, and you guys will see above here, where's that email? Let's grab it. So you guys will see here that I have this test sender right here, right? This is basically what's showing, and then we have this email address. If I pretty much omit this from the environment variable, then all that will show is just the email address as the from name of this email. So you might as well just add that in just to make things look a lot nicer in your user's inbox. So let's just go back here. Cool. And again, you can populate any name that you want to do there, or any name that you want to use. All right, so the next thing we'll work with here is we're going to basically need to define an email host. We're going to say next public underscore email underscore host. Now this setting or this value will come from your SMTP email settings. So you need to check what those are online. They can differ based on the mail server that you're using. Let's just say we'll use Google's, which is smtp.gmail.com, and that's public information. So it's fine if you guys can see that. All right. The next one we'll define here is the password. And obviously I won't expose that to you guys, but I'll show you how this works. So we're going to say next underscore public underscore, let's call it email underscore password. And just set that equal to something. We'll just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for now. Obviously, it's not a real password. All right, so don't try to copy it, guys. All right, so the next one will be next underscore public, and we need to basically define the port from which this email will be sent. So email port, and that won't be a string. That's going to be an integer. So it's going to be, because we're going to be using SSL as our protocol, we'll just set that as 465 as the port number. All right, so basically that's all you need, guys, for the environment variable piece to this. Just make sure you copy these to a T. Now what I'm going to go ahead is jump into the future and move back to our client.js file and start populating that. All right, so now we're back in our client.js file. So we're going to start working with this, but before we do that, one thing I thought about, guys, is that we have this .getignore file here to the left. Let's just open this up. And basically, if you guys are not familiar with how .getignore works, you basically in here have some configurations that you can set so that any file of these names or any folder with these names that's within your project will not be committed to GitHub when you push. All right, so it won't be committed to your source control repository. What I generally like to do here is if I do a search using Command F and type in here .env, I generally like to add the .env right below this .env star.local. So I'm just going to add that here. Normally, I wouldn't have to do that because it should be getting picked up with this entry right here. But I generally like to hard code that in here in the event that someone else comes in here and removes this. We still have this in here. And the reason why I'm doing this is because, again, we'll have email passwords stored in our .env file. And we definitely don't want to expose very sensitive information to our GitHub repos, even if they are private. So you want to make sure you come in here and do that. Some people may prefer not to do that. That's your decision. That's just what I like to do. All right. So I think we're good there with .getignore. Let's just close out of that. All right, let's move on to some of the coding. So as I mentioned before, we need to build up our client.js file. So that way we can utilize our node mailer instance and send email. So to do that, the very first thing we need to do is import the node mailer package in here. So we're going to type in here import node mailer, and nothing comes up obviously. So we need to do an explicit reference here. I'm going to say from node mailer, and you can see where we get the auto suggest here. So I'll hit enter on that in a semicolon, and that's going to basically bring in our node mailer instance. All right, so next what we're going to do is just pretty much define our configuration code. So let's see, how do we want to do this? So first I need to set the admin email, okay? And again, if you guys remember, we defined that in our .env file. Okay, so to do that, let's create a new variable. We will say const admin email, and this is just JavaScript, okay? Now within any Node.js application, which Next.js is a Node.js based framework, you would have access to the process object, which is usually part of the global namespace. So the process object will allow us to reference our environment variables in here. So we just need to type here process.env for environment, and then we need to specify here the name of the environment variable. And that was next_public _ admin email, I believe. So next_public _ admin _ email. And that should give us the value that we set in our .env file. Now we need to grab the full version of this email definition here. So we're going to say admin email full, and that's going to be set to process.env.next_public _admin _email _full. And again, we defined that in the .env as well. Now we need to grab the password. So we're going to say const pass is equal to process.env .next_public _email _password. All right, let's see. I think we're good there because essentially we just need to grab the email and the password because that's what we're going to be using to set up our mail options object. So let's go ahead and define our mail options right now. So we need to export an object called mail options. So I'm going to say export const mail options. I'm going to set that equal to an object. And basically in this object, I can put a semicolon at the end. It's not necessary, but I like to do it. In this object, we're going to have two attributes, from and to. So for from, we're going to set that equal to the admin email full. And then the to, we're going to set that to the admin email full. We can also set that to just admin email, but let's keep things consistent. It would work either way. And you can test that out for yourself if you would like. All right. The reason why I'm specifying the full one anyway is so that way the user's name, the recipient's name would also be shown in the email signature, or not signature, but the header. All right. So let's work now on the actual transporter. So basically the way that the node mailer works is essentially you have a transporter object. And that transporter object's main responsibility is to send the email. It collects some information, specifies security, authentication, and then it sends the email using that information. So to do that, we're just going to define a brand new function. We're going to export const, and we'll call this transporter as well. And we're going to set that equal to our node mailer instance, which we brought in above. And then the node mailer package has a method called create transporter. All right, create transport rather, which will set up our transporter object. Now within this, this takes an options object. So I'm just going to put curly braces between the parentheses and hit enter like that. And then we just need to pass in some attributes here. So the first one's going to be host. And you see we get some auto suggest here. And the host is going to be process.env. And if you guys remember, we have an email host environment variable that we set. So we're going to say next_public_email_host, comma. All right. So that's the host, and that's basically going to be the SMTP host for this mail server. And again, I'm using Gmail, so that's going to be the smtp.gmail.com host. So next we're going to set up our port, which was the 465. We could hard code it, but why not use environment variables instead? So we're going to say process.env what was it again? next_public_email_port. I think it was that. Okay. And then finally, well, not finally, we actually have a couple more. So what we need to do is we need to also define the security. So there's an attribute called secure, and I'm just going to set that to true. And what that's going to do is it's basically going to allow us to use authentication to log in order to send this email. We can log into the mail server to send this email. It's also going to encrypt the contents using the SSL or TLS protocols, whatever have you. Okay, so I'm just going to hit a comma here at the end, and then we have an auth object that we can define. So we need some curly braces here, and within this auth object, we need to pass a user and a pass attribute. So the user attribute is going to be the admin email, not the full one, just the admin email. Okay, and then the password will be pass. Now we can do it like that because again we have the pass variable above in which we're pulling the email password. Now we can do pass like this, but because we're passing an attribute that is the same name as the variable defined above, we can just get rid of that and just say pass like this, and it'll automatically construct the key value pair. That's just basic JavaScript. One thing I want to point out, guys, in case you guys are wondering, is when you are using SSL and TLS, you just kind of have to understand the differences. Obviously, TLS is a much newer way of working with email, but you just want to make sure you have the right SMTP settings as well defined here. And also one other thing to point out, I'm using Google Workspace to send these emails. And I know that some mail servers require you to set up an app password instead of using like a user login password. So you want to make sure that you understand the requirements of your mail server. In my case, I had to generate a brand new app password through the Google accounts or accounts.google.com domain. I just went to that in my browser, and then I think I scrolled down and created a brand new app password. So you guys just want to make sure that you do that as well. Otherwise, it won't work. All right, I think we're good here. I think we have already set up everything we needed to set up for this file. So I'm just going to go ahead. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and close out of this. All right, so the next thing I want to do is let's go ahead and open up our HTML file, and that was called contact_form.html. Now again, this is going to be our email template that we saw in our demonstration. So in here, what I'll go ahead and do is I'll start constructing the email template. All right, so obviously we cannot access our Tailwind styles directly unless we were to do some reconfiguration. So I'm just going to use some basic CSS styling here in line to style this email. So first I'm going to define a new div. Like that, I'll open it up, and I'm going to give that an attribute of style, which is just a basic CSS attribute. I'm going to give it a font family, and let's give it sans serif, so a very basic font. Okay. All right, so now what I want to have in here is I'm going to have an H1, and in this H1, I'm just going to say contact form inquiry, like that. All right. That's just going to be the heading of our email that you saw earlier. And now I'm going to also have a paragraph tag. So I'm going to say P right here. You have received the following inquiry. Okay, let's make sure to spell you have received the following inquiry. I think that's correct. Okay, good. All right, so now we get into the nitty gritty, guys. So what we need to do here is, because we're going to be limited on styling, I could really delve deep into like styling with crazy CSS here, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to use a break tag just to kind of add some additional spacing between elements. And then I'm going to add a P. And for the first one, we're going to output the name. Now, there's many ways to do this. Essentially, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be replacing a placeholder or a merge tag within this template with the actual value. Now, there are many packages that can help you sort of bind data to static HTML templates within like a Node.js environment. But I want to avoid using so many packages to explain very basic concepts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write my own code that's going to use regex and replace the values with the merge tags that we define here. So for example, for name, I'm just going to use I'm going to kind of use the Django template tag syntax. I'm going to use a double curly brace to start that merge tag. And then here I'm just going to put first name and then space, double closing curlies, another space, double opening again, and we automatically got the closing here. We're going to say last name, because we're just going to output the full name on one line like that, right? So essentially, once I build the logic code, the regex code, it'll basically pull in this entire template as just raw HTML, and then it's going to look for instances where we have these double curly braces, and it's going to look at the variable names written here, and then it will replace based on what the current variable name is, and it's going to replace it with the associated value. Hopefully that made sense the way I explained it. Okay, so we're going to have another paragraph tag here, and then we'll define email. We'll do the same thing. We're going to say email like that. Let's add a break tag here, and let's add another paragraph tag. We say message. And down here, what I'm going to do is let's add the message within a paragraph tag, because again, this is going to be coming from a text area field. Once we build the form, you guys exactly will see how that works. So we're going to just call that message. So now, with that being said, guys, what we need to do is when we build this out, we need to make sure that we have the same exact variables defined in our code, so that way it knows exactly what values to be replaced, right? I don't think I needed any additional tags here. Cool. So I think we're done with this. So this is pretty much done. I'm just going to close out of this. And I think we said we're done with layout. So I guess what we can work on now is let's go and open up our page.jsx file, which is within our app directory, and start working on that. Because so far what we've got is this boilerplate template here. All right, so now what I'm going to do is let's start delving a bit deeper into some more advanced topics here. Now, Next.js 13 plus, so versions 13 and 14 at the time of this video, have separated concerns essentially, because prior we've always had the concept of client-side components versus server-side components, but it was very hard to understand the difference between the two and to know when to utilize one of the or the other, or in some cases both if you have multiple components, right? So what they've done to make things simpler is they've created new directives that we can put at the very top of our files to specify whether the current file should be rendered client side or server side. And there's relevance to that. If you guys want to know more about the differences between the two, look at my Next.js crash course on this channel, because I delve really deep into the differences between the two by building out a project that relates to client-side components versus server-side components. All right, so the first thing we want to do here is we want to use one of those directives. So I'm just going to get rid of this import React line. I'm going to open up a set of single quotes, and I'm going to use client like that. And that's now going to make this a client-side component. All right, so let's get rid of this. I'm just going to replace that with a React fragment and open it up like that. All right, so what we'll do is let's start defining this homepage component. All right, so in here, actually what we'll need to do is we need to bring in a couple of things here. We'll need to eventually bring in some state so that we can hold certain values based on certain conditions, okay? But first, let's start with our form data. We need to find a way, we need to have a way to store the form data as we input it. As the user inputs the first name, last name, and message, we need to have a way to store that within the React state. So let's just define const. I'm going to open up a set of square brackets, and this is exactly how we define state in React and Next.js. We're going to say, we're going to call the variable form data, and this is going to be the variable that we'll use to reference or get the values, comma, then we're going to define a setter. So we're going to say set form data, and then we're going to say that's going to be equal to the use state, which is part of the React package. So you guys can see above it brought back that React reference. And then in here, we're just going to pass it an options object and a semicolon at the end. I'm going to place my cursor between the curly braces and hit enter, because in here, I'm going to define a first name and set that to a default of empty string, followed by last name, set that to a default of empty string, and then email, set that to a default of empty string, and finally message, and set that to a default. And what this is doing is we're predefining our state, because what will happen is we'll create an event handler that when the user types within an input field in a form, it'll automatically update these values within this form data state. So that's basically how that's going to work. Next up, what we'll need a state to keep track of whether we are submitting the form or not. So we're going to say const, we're going to call that submitting, set submitting. We'll set that equal to a use state. And in here, we're going to need either a true or a false value. We're going to use false because by default, we want to say that we are not submitting the form. So obviously, when the page first loads, when the user first goes to this web page, we are not loading, or rather, we are not submitting the form. Though it's a brand new page render, and the user hasn't even entered anything yet. So we need to set that to false to represent that state. We have the submitting state, and when we click the button, we're going to basically have a handler that will set this submitting to true, so that way the application knows that the form is currently being submitted. And the reason why we might want to have that is, for example, we might want to have some sort of page loader or spinner within the button or within the entire page to know that, hey, this form is being submitted, so display, please wait or now loading while that's happening. And once it's done, make it go away or disappear. Okay? So that's the reason why we have these states. That's why it's called React, guys. So it's definitely very important. It's an important concept to understand. All right, let's move on. Let's see here. You know what? Let's go ahead and let's start building out part of our JSX or our HTML-like structure below. Because essentially what I'm going to do is, as we go through this, I'm going to create more functions to work with this. All right. Before we do that, let's go ahead and save those changes. I'm going to go ahead and try to run the server and see what we have. I think we're running the server already. Are we? Let's go back to the other tab. It looks like we may be running the server. So now let's flip to our browser. Where is it? Okay. And to open up our application, I'm just going to click on a new tab here. We want to type in our address bar localhost colon 3000 and hit enter. Okay, so it looks like we're having some issues. So let's go back here. What I'm going to do is, yep, we're not running our server. So let's clear out of this. Now to run our server, we need to type npm run dev to run the dev server. Okay, cool. So npm run dev. All right, so now it's loading our environment variables, as you guys can see right here. It's loading that up for us. All right, so I'm expecting an error message. So let's go back to our browser, and it's automatically doing a hot reload right here. Okay, it looks like we might be good, guys. There's no error message. Looks good to go there. So it's obviously a blank page right now, and the page is dark. So it looks like that's working so far so good. Let's flip back to our code. Thought we would have an error, but we were lucky there. Okay, so now let's start building out our JSX. JSX is basically like HTML. But when you're using this within the React or Next.js world, we call it JSX because it's really part of a functional component. All right, so first what we'll do is we'll define a section like that. We'll use this section HTML tag, and we're going to use the class name. And for this, we're going to be using a combination of inline Tailwind CSS styles as well as our CSS file that we've defined already. So first up, what we're going to do is we're going to say here contact-form, which I believe is a style within, it's actually contact-form-section, and I believe that's a style within our Tailwind CSS. Let me just go to our globals.css really quickly and search for contact-form, and here it is right here, right below, contact-form-section. So this automatically has some styles pre-configured. Okay, let's go back to our page.jsx. All right, so that's going to give us some styles. We won't see anything yet because obviously we don't have any text elements within this. All right, let's start working on that now. So let's see. Let's first start with an H1, and that's going to be contact us. Save. So if I flip back to my browser here, you see that we have the contact us, and it's centered to the page because we already have the container centered to the page. Cool. All right, so that's the H1. Next, what we'll need to have is the actual form. So I'm going to say form and close that out. Now, guys, if you notice that my tags close very quickly because I have a plugin or an extension installed in Visual Studio Code, and basically it allows me to automatically close tags as soon as I type this greater than sign. You can type it out if you don't have that installed, but I believe it's called auto close tag or something like that. So just do a search for that. There are plenty of those extensions within the marketplace. So we're going to say form on submit because we need to have an on submit. We basically need to have a handler that will fire whenever we submit this form. I'm just going to set that to null for now because I'll come back later and I'll actually create that email handler, or rather the form handler. Next up, what we'll do here is let's create a div. And for this div, I'm missing something here. Div. Now within this div, what we're going to do is we're going to have kind of a similar structure for every single input field. We're going to say div class name. We're going to set that equal to form-control, which is another style from our CSS file. And within this, we're going to have two things. We're going to have a label, so just say label, and then we're going to have the actual input field. So for the label, for the first label, this is going to be for the first name. So I'm going to type for the HTML4 first name with a capital N. So the F is lowercase, and basically this is going to be equal to the ID of the input. So we want to, I'll show you guys what I mean in a second. So I'm just going to type here first name like that, and then we're going to have an input field here. So we're going to say input, and that's going to be a self-closing tag. So we're just going to add a / and then the closing bracket. And in here, we're going to type out type is going to be equal to text. And let's see, what else do we want to type out here? We're going to say ID. That's going to be equal to the first name that we defined above. Now, these two must match. So basically, the HTML4 and the ID must match. And the reason, it doesn't really have to match, but it should match if you want, for example, the cursor to be on focus if the user clicks the label. So if the user clicks first name, for example, then the cursor will be automatically placed on focus within the input field. If you don't do that, then if the user clicks the label, nothing will happen. The user would have to explicitly click on the input in order to put their cursor within the box. So this is just like a cool accessibility feature. If you match those two values, the ID of the input with the label HTML4, okay? The set a name attribute, we're gonna set a name attribute on all of these. We're gonna call that also first name. We can call that anything, but I generally like to match it with the ID so I know what I'm working with. Placeholder, we're gonna just say enter first name, ... And then lastly, we're gonna have our onChange handler. So we're gonna say onChange, and I'm gonna open up some curly braces here, and we're gonna create an onChange handler called handle input change. Okay, now that doesn't exist right now, so let's go back up here to the top, and let's find a home for this. So we're gonna put it right here. So I'm gonna say const handle input change. I'm going to set that equal to the event object I'm passing in, and it's going to be an arrow function like that. And I'm going to hit Command S to save because I'm OCD. Now this basically, let me just explain if you guys are not sure what I'm doing. So this is called an event handler, and this event handler, whenever the user types in the field, even if it's just one character, as soon as the user types, this function will be called. This JavaScript function will be called every single time. And then what we'll do in here is we'll use this event object, or E, to update our state, which is the form data object within our React state. All right, so to do that, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to destruct the name and the value from the event target object. So I'm going to say const curly braces name comma value. I'm going to set that equal to e.target. So this .target would have all of the values that's being sent through the event, right? So every time the user types in the field, then the target object would contain the value, the current value that's in that field. All right, so this is going to grab us the name and the value. The name would, in this case, would be the first name that we defined in our input down here, and then the value would be whatever's in the current input. All right, or the one that's on focused. All right, so the only thing we have to do here is we need to just update our state. So we need to call that setter method above. We need to say set form data parentheses and a semicolon, and in here we're just going to pass that options object. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to spread across using ... form data. And what this spread operator, these three dots, what that does is it takes the current values that's within the object and it automatically remaps it to this new object to spread it across. Otherwise, you would have to do, if you didn't do that, you would have to say first name like this and then set the first name, the value, for example. So that's a very sloppy way of doing it. The quicker way using JavaScript is to just spread it across as a quick way. All right, and then lastly here, what we want to do, we just want to make sure we have that comma at the end here. We're just going to open up a set of square brackets, and we're going to pass in here name and then value like that. And this comma is optional if you want to have it. But basically what these square brackets will do, guys, if you're not familiar, is that the name that I'm passing in, which in this case will be equal to first name, the value below, this name that we set on this element, is basically going to take that value and then set that as the key to this entry. So the key will be first name, and then the value, for example, will be like John. So it'll look like this within this state, okay? So that's all that's doing. Instead of us having a hard code that we can keep reusing this function to update our state based on the values. Now, the one thing I'll point out before we continue here is if I look down here again, where we define our name here, you want to make sure that this value here, this name equals this first name, you want to make sure that that's equal to the first, property or the attribute that's within the state up here. In order for this function to work, it has to know where to map to. So make sure that those are the same. So likewise, we'll do the same for last name, email, and message, and we'll make sure that that name attribute's value will match those. All right, so I think to quickly jump ahead here, I'm just going to copy this here and go to the next line and paste, and we'll go one by one here. So for this label, we're going to change the second one to last name and the text within it to last name like this. And then the type will still be text, the ID, so that we can make it better in terms of accessibility will be last name. This will be changed to last name, placeholder, enter last name, and then the on change will be the same thing because we're going to reuse the same function over and over again. Okay, next we're going to do email, so I'm going to come down here, paste again. And for this HTML4, we're going to change this one because the ID will also be email. And then we're going to change this label text to email like that. And then the input type will be email, not text, because we want the proper client-side validation to work, the browser validation to work. So we're going to just change this ID to email and this name to email as well. And value, we're just going to say here, instead of enter first name, we're going to say enter email. Okay, and then the same handler. And then finally, down here, we're not gonna paste this one in. We're gonna have to type this one out because essentially what we're gonna have here is a text area field. Okay, and this is gonna be defined a little bit differently. All right, so I'll show what happened there. One sec. All right. All right, so we're gonna still have the same form control. So we're gonna say div and come back up here. And on this line, we're gonna say class name is form-control. And we're still gonna have to, I guess I could have pasted it in, but you know, it's too late now. So we're gonna say label, and we're gonna call this one message. Now I'm just thinking here. So, all right, so we'll do the same thing. We'll say HTML4. We're gonna say message like that because this was also going to be the ID as well. And down here, we're gonna have a text area, not an input, because we need to have multi-line input here. Text area, actually we'll leave it on one line like that. So on this text area element, we're gonna set the ID to message as well to match the HTML4. So we can have that on focus. And then we're gonna say name is gonna be message. That's gonna match our state above, right? So we gotta make sure it's named the same. We're also gonna set a cols or a columns object or attribute. And we're gonna set that to 10 columns wide. And we're gonna have a rows, and we're gonna set that to 10 rows long. And we're gonna have a placeholder. Let's say placeholder. That's gonna be, what can we put here? Let's just say enter message. Nice and simple, doesn't really matter. And then on change is gonna be, again, the handle input change. All right, I think that part is good. Yep, I think that should be all right. I don't think we'll see anything. Yes, we do. Perfect. All right, so this is what we have so far. If you flip back to the browser, you have your input fields here. Cool. All right, now we need to add the button. So the button will come at the very bottom just before the form ending tag here. And we're just going to say button. And for the button, let's say send message. So send message. Now for this button, now there are two ways for us to submit the form. There's one way that I prefer and there's one way that some people do, like some other people use. One way to do it is to use just the onSubmit event handler above that we set on the form tag. If I scroll back up here, you guys will see that on the form tag here, we've set this onSubmit. I currently have that set to null. So that's one way that you can submit it once we define our handle submit function. The other way is you can use a button click event here, and then you can grab the data directly from the form fields, which is a little bit more work. And I prefer to do it using I think it's even the preferred way to use the submit handler instead. So we're just gonna, keep things nice and simple. Let's first just define our class name. I forgot that. We're gonna set that to BTN to give it that green button, pill button look. And we're gonna set the type in order for this form handler to work on the submit event, we have to set the type of this button to submit because the type of the button normally is just button. And if we don't set that, then it won't work. So we need to set this to submit for this to work. All right, so let's just look at the styling we've got so far. Styling looks great. All right, okay, now obviously if I click this, nothing will happen. So we need to define our event handler. Just refresh that and let's go back. Now, so to define an event handler, we would do essentially the same thing that we did above. And that's to create a new JavaScript function to handle the event object. So before I do that, what I will do is I'll come back up here to our form element and let's replace this null with handle submit. That's going to be the name of our function. Then let's come back up here and let's define that function. Const handle submit. And that's going to take in an event object and it's an arrow function like that. And guys, make sure that you save as you go along. Use Command S on a Mac or Control S on a Windows to save. Now, essentially, what this function is going to do is it's going to call an API route. And that API route will then handle the email processing, okay? We could write our email processing in here as well, but I prefer to use the API route. Plus, that will introduce you to how API routes work in Next.js 14. So to work with API routes, because all of the requests and responses will be handled asynchronously. So we need to come up here and right after the equal symbol, we need to type here async. So that way we can make this an async function because we're basically going to await our responses that we get back from the server. First thing we're going to do is we're going to say e.prevent default. So that way we can prevent the normal form submission behavior that happens as part of the browser's normal behavior. We want to do that so with that we can use JavaScript to submit our data asynchronously and to retrieve our data asynchronously. All right. All right, so the next thing I'll do, let me just come back up here. I'm going to use our set submitting function, right? So set submitting. I'm going to set that to true, and we want to do that so that we can keep track of whether the form is submitting, because if you guys recall here, basically at this stage of the game, let me just tab over here. At this stage of the game, once the user clicks the button and the form submits, it's going to hit this handle submit. So that means that the submission process has begun. So we generally want to set our state to true here to keep track of that, okay? So if you think of it in terms of when you click the button, now the process begins. So now we need to display to the user something like now loading, or we need to handle a certain set of behaviors, okay? So I'm just going to add a comment here. I'm going to say here is where we will start to send the email. Now, to send the email, I guess what I'll do first here is, let me think. Let's go ahead and define the caller. So basically the code that will call our API route. We'll go ahead and define that here. And then next, we'll go ahead and create an API route in Next.js's new way of handling things. So let's go ahead and let's create a const response variable, because this is what we're going to be getting back from the server, and we need to await that response. And I'm just going to use the built-in fetch function in JavaScript to fetch the data. Okay, and we need to just pass this a string, and we're going to call the route of API / contact -us. Now this will take in an options object, so we'll say comma, and we're passing curly braces. I'll put a semicolon at the end of this so I don't forget. All right, now there's a few attributes we need to pass here. So the first one's going to be a method, and I'm going to set that to post like that. The second one will be headers, and that's going to take in an object, so curly braces here. The first entry will be content type as a string, and we're going to say application /JSON, so that way we can prep the we can prep this request and the intended response to be of JSON data type. So the next one, we're just going to accept like that. Again, application /JSON. All right. And then finally here, we're going to have a comma at the end of this curly brace right here. And hit enter. We're going to say body. And we need to basically set the body. So what data are we going to send to our API route? And that's going to be the form data that we've stored so far. Because again, if you guys recall, every time the user types into a field, we're updating our form data object. So if I scroll back up here to show you guys what's going on here, here we go. So right here, we have this object. This is an object. So really, we don't have to do much manipulation here. We can grab this entire object, which has our first name, last name, email, and message. But in order to do that, we need to first serialize that object, so that way we can pass it across our endpoint. So to serialize or to stringify, we just say JSON.stringify to convert that to a string, and then we pass in our form data like that. And now I think that has been set up to be sent. All right. So the next thing that we want to do, I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and let's make some space out here. Let's go ahead and handle our response. Now, for the response, what I plan on doing is sending back a success attribute and an error. So in the event that an error occurs, we need to be able to handle that scenario as well. So first, I'm going to destruct those two attributes. I'm going to say const curly braces select an error, and that's going to come from the await response.json, right? Because this response will return JSON, so we just need to call .json on that, and we need to await it because this is within an asynchronous function. In the event of it being a success, we're going to say if success. If we get a successful result, we just are going to output an alert. And here we're going to say your inquiry has been submitted. Oops, has been submitted. Let's use an exclamation point. All right, so again, this is going to output, you can use a modal here if you want to make things look a bit nicer. But just for the sakes of this tutorial, I'm just going to use a basic alert. So, it's going to output your inquiry has been submitted if it is successful. Otherwise, if we have an error, we need to do something else, right? We want to make this as user-friendly as possible. So let's see, what can we do? First, for the development team, we can say console.error and just output the error so that the devs can look at it and know exactly what's happening. And I guess what we can do for the user's sake of things is we can say error while, actually, you know what? Yeah, let's say error while submitting. Now let's make it a bit more grammatically correct. Let's say an error occurred while submitting your inquiry. And that should be it. That should be good to go there. You can probably even add here, please contact support, just as an example. All right, so I think that is good so far. The only other thing we want to do is outside of this, just before the end of this function, we want to set our set submitting back to false. We're going to say set submitting is equal to false because now we're done processing the form. We have our results, so we just need to reset that back to false. And again, a common use case scenario would be a spinner or a loader will disappear at this stage because now we're done loading or processing something. All right, I think we're good there, guys. So now we've set up our API call. So next thing we need to do is we need to actually define our API route. So let me just go ahead and click save on this. I just want to see how this looks so far. So I'll click save and I will go back to our browser and we see that everything still looks the same. Everything cosmetically looks the same, but obviously we've added functionality that we can eventually test. You know what? We can try to go ahead and test right now. Let's just enter in some dummy data. Ron Buchanan, say test again at example.com. And let's just say this is a test message. Okay, so what do you guys think will happen? All right, let's go ahead and hit the send message button. Okay, did we forget something? No, I don't think we have. Let's go ahead and open up our inspect. So I'm just gonna right click and I'm gonna open up my inspect tool here in the browser like that by clicking inspect. And we're gonna go to the console. And we're gonna see some warnings, but what we're looking for is the very last one here. So we have an uncaught exception, right? And basically we have a syntax error, unexpected token. Yeah, so we're basically getting back some sort of HTML, and I can tell because it has that left bracket. So to see better what's happening, I don't think it'll be in network at this stage because we didn't really have network open. So let's go to network. Yeah, so let me just go ahead and refresh this again. I just want to show you guys what happens if the code is incomplete. So let's go ahead and do that again. Let's say Ron Buchanan test at example.com. Just put some gibberish, it doesn't really matter. And let's just submit. Now you guys will see what's going to happen here. All right, so now if I were to look for that, it looks like we have a 404 error, basically. Let me see if I can get some more information here on this. So if I sort like this, there we go. We have a 404 error. If I click into that, I'll show what happened there. But basically, it's not finding the route, right? Because we haven't really defined that route yet. So this is expected. So what we want to do is we want to define that API route. That's why we're getting that 404 error. So let's go back to our application. And now is where we define API routes within Next.js. So to do that, let's go back to our app folder here, our app directory. And in here, I'm going to create a brand new directory. So I'm going to come up here, click the new folder icon. I'm going to call that API because this directory has to match our endpoint. So I'll hit enter. And if you guys recall here, just kind of going back to the code here, in the code here, we define or we specify this API/contact us route. So we basically need to have a route that matches that. So to match that, we need to have the right folder structure. So we have this API folder I just created. So within this, I need to now create another folder called contact us to match the endpoint. So we're going to say contact-us as a folder, not a file, guys, a folder. Now within this contact us, we need to have a route.js or a route.ts if you're using TypeScript file. So let's go ahead, I'm going to click new file, route.js, hit enter. All right. So this is the brand new way, which I really love this, of defining endpoints. The old way was a little bit convoluted, to be honest. So I really like this new way of defining endpoints. It's very simple, just using folder structures. You can definitely get a little bit more advanced than that, but it's definitely a cool way of doing it. All right. So now what we need to do is we need to create some route handlers here to handle this request, right? So coming in here, this is going to work for Next.js 13 and up. Next.js 12 and lower, it will not work. You would have to use the old way of doing it, which is something I'm not going to cover in this video. But essentially, if you follow this for Next.js 13, 14, and higher, at least until there's another change made, it should work. So the first thing I want to do is I want to bring in our mail options. If you guys recall what that was, if I go back to our client.js file, we have our mail options here, which has our from and to attributes. All right, so let's go back to route. So I want to bring that in. I'm going to say import mail should automatically come up if I do that. Options, and if I hit enter, it automatically brings it in. If it didn't do that for you, just go ahead and type out this here. Actually, it did not bring it in correctly. Let me just change that here. It should have brought it in. It has to be the lowercase m. Okay, it's not getting picked up. Actually, it's right here. Yes, the one that's coming from email slash client. So I'll hit enter on that, and now we've got it. So this is the correct one. You guys want to make sure you have the correct one that has the lowercase m, because that's the variable that we defined. And I'll hit a comma on that. So we need the mail options and we need the transporter object. All right, because that's how we're going to send our email. All right, next up, what we need to do is we need to have a way to basically replace, and now that I think about it, we haven't defined that yet. So we need to have actually a way to replace the merge tags that's in our template, right? So we're going to need a couple of helper functions to do this. So what I'm going to do here is, let's think, what's the best way here? I think what I can do, and there's many ways to do this, guys. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my emails folder here. I'm just going to highlight that, and I'm going to create another file within this. And this file is going to hold our helpers. I always click the wrong thing here. Let me just get out of this. So this file is going to contain our helpers. So I'm just going to click on that. I'm going to call this helpers.js and hit enter. And it'll create this file for us. I'm just going to close out of this untitled one. Perfect. Okay. So we have this helpers.js file. And in here, I'm just going to put the helper functions that we'll need to do the parsing for our template. All right. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create two functions. One will be to replace the merge tags within. If I open up our contact form, you guys will recall we have these double curly braces, and then we are specifying the variable name. So one function will be replacing these merge tags with the actual values, and then the other one will be to strip the HTML tags so that we can have a plain text version of this template as well, because we need to have that in the event that the user does not support HTML formatting in their email. All right, so you'll see what I mean in a second. Let's go back to helpers.js. All right, so the first one here, I'm going to call, what do we want to do first? Let's work first with the stripping one, the one that strips the HTML tags. So I'm going to say export to export this const strip HTML tags. Set that equal to HTML string, because what we'll do is we'll pass in the HTML into this function, and we'll make that an arrow function. So this essentially is just going to be a one-liner, because what we'll do is we'll pass in the HTML string, and we're going to replace any kind of tag that's in the HTML, as well as the break tags, so that way we don't have additional spacing. So we're going to say return HTML string, and we're just going to use the replace function here. We're going to call .replace. I think it should work like that, right? Because, yeah, so HTML string .replace, and we're going to just replace. We're going to use some regex here to do the replacing. So we're going to say /br and /G for the global, because we want to replace all instances of the break tag here. And we're going to say comma, replace those with a \n, which is the new line character. So we're basically replacing the break tags in HTML with new line characters so that the email doesn't actually literally type out the break tag. Then we're going to chain another replace. So we're going to say .replace. And in this replace, what we'll do is we'll replace any other HTML tags with just an empty string. So let's see. I'm just going to copy, because I actually wrote this out in a different editor here, because it's going to get a little bit sloppy. So let me just explain. I'll walk you guys through it here. All right, so we're going to come here and paste this in. This is the expression. I'm going to say comma and then empty string here, like that. I might be missing a / somewhere. Let's see. Yes, I'm missing the /. So now I think about it, we need this bracket here as well. So we're going to basically saying / bracket and then the square brackets, because within these square brackets, we're basically just saying get me any element that has a closing bracket within it. So with this first one right here, this left bracket is looking for give me any element or any instance that has an opening bracket. And then once we have that, we're now using this caret at the top to say, or the one that points to the top to say, get me any element regardless what's between these brackets, but it must have a closing bracket. And then the /G is basically saying, look for all instances of where this is the case. And then we're just replacing that with an empty string. I think this should work. And we can test this out shortly just to make sure that things look good. Right. And one other thing I'll point out, guys, here is I'm not a regex expert. So generally what I do is there are many different regex editors or regex calculators online that you can use for JavaScript and other programming languages. I generally use those and then I test and test and test until I find the one that works. Also, in the video description, as you know, we have the GitHub repo. So, make sure you reference that repo just to kind of understand what's going on, because typing it is one thing just to get the mechanics down, but the other part of this is, just reading the code in its best form to understand exactly how things work between the various components. Cool, so this function is done. The last function we need to export const. We're going to call this one replace HTML. Actually, we're going to call this replace merge tags, because remember, we need to replace those double curly brace tags. We're going to set that equal to, this is going to take two arguments. It's going to take the data, so the actual variable values as an object, and it's going to take the HTML string. That's going to be an arrow function as well. And we're going to open up our curly braces. Now here, we're getting an object of data. So the object would look something like this. Let me just do a comment here. The object basically would be the form data, right? So it's going to say like first name, and then Ron, and then it's going to say last name, for example, and so on, right? It's going to have the same structure as our form data. So to loop through this object, because it's not an array in itself, we need to loop through the keys. So we're going to say object.keys, and then we're going to pass in here the data object. Now, in the event that the data object is null, we don't want things to just crash. So I'm going to use a question mark here to make it a nullable type to say that this is possibly null. So if it's null, just ignore this entire statement. Then we're going to say dot for each, and then curly braces, or not curly, but parentheses. And then the first argument here will be the key, like that. And then I'm going to open up our object here and hit enter, and then a semicolon at the end. All right, so this key variable will be basically the 10th variable for every iteration of this loop, because this is essentially a for loop. It's going to loop through every single key. So first name, last name, email a message, and then it's going to do something. And I'll show you exactly. This is going to get a little complicated, guys, so just kind of follow along the best way you can. So the first thing I want to do is I want to check if basically the key, the current key, can be found anywhere in the HTML template surrounded by curly braces. So let's say if HTML string dot includes, and what we want it to include is the double curly braces. So we're just going to use some backticks here, like that. Double curly braces in a space. You got to make sure the space is there, and we're just going to pass in $, another set of curly braces, key, right? So basically it's going to look for that string, and it's going to inject the value of key, which is going to be the key within our object. So first name, last name, and so on. Let's open up our curly braces here, because if this is within our HTML template, we want to basically get the value first. So let's say let val, and the val will be data, and then we're going to pass in between the square brackets the key to get the value. So for first name, if it's John, we're basically getting John from that object. That's all we're doing here. Now that we have our value being parsed out from the template, what we'll do is we'll just we're basically going to define our regex pattern, because what we'll need to do is we'll need to use regex in order to get to replace this value. So I'm going to say here const regex pattern. This is just going to be a string pattern. We're going to set that to a new regex object, because that's a JavaScript built-in object that we can use to create a regex pattern. Now, what I'm going to do is, because this is going to get, again, pretty complicated, I'm going to copy out here the entire pattern, and I'll explain it one by one as I go through it. So let's go back here, and here we're going to paste that in like this, and then I'm going to just say comma right after it, and I'm going to pass in G for global. So it's basically this G that's here, as well as the G that's above, symbolizes basically any instance of this that's found within the template, replace it with whatever we want to replace it with. Now, this regex pattern looks very, very confusing, doesn't it? But basically what we're doing here is we're basically specifying that we want to replace the key within the template with the actual value. So this is what's coming back here, okay? So we're using the double backslash to escape one backslash, and then we have here our double curly braces, and then we're passing this in here. Basically, we have this S character to basically say for any string or character, we're going to be looking for the key, and if we found a match here, then we're going to replace that. And we haven't written that part yet. This is just the patterns to set this up. All right. Now, if you guys want to know exactly what that pattern does, you can copy that pattern after you've typed it out and go to like a regex calculator or a regex pattern checker and paste it in and see what happens. Okay. And it should give you some sort of output. I pretty much got it from online. I did not think of that myself. I got it online. Again, there's many ways to do this, but if you want to do this with just pure code, you can use regex, or you can loop through the nodes of the HTML string, which can also be quite complicated. So this is probably one of the easiest ways using boilerplate code. All right, so now we just need to reset our HTML string. We're going to set that equal to HTML string dot replace, and what we'll replace from the regex pattern that we'll pass in, we're going to just replace the value, the val. Okay. All right, so I think that would do that. And then lastly, we need to return that HTML string. Now, because we're passing this into the function, we should be good. It should be within the scope. So it's just going to come down here and say return HTML string and semicolon. All right. I think that was the complicated stuff. because we need to check if this is going to work, right? All right, cool. So I think we're good here. And let's go back. Where were we? We were in our route folder file. Let's go back to route. All right, cool. So in our route file, we now need to bring in those methods. We're going to say import replace merge tags right here, and then we're also going to bring in the strip HTML tags, right? Because we just need those two functions so that way we can actually carry out our logic. All right. Also, what we'll need to do is we need to bring in our next response. All right, and this is a built-in namespace within the Next.js framework that allows us to return a response to the caller from the server. All right, so the old way of doing it is that you'd normally use some sort of JSON return. This also has a built-in JSON return, but the next response is a bit more optimized in how it handles the the responses. Okay, now in order for us to access the template, the HTML template, we need to have basically some references to grab the template. We need a path reference to grab the file, and then we need the fs reference to read the file. So we're going to say import fs from, and there's a namespace called fs. So import fs from fs, and then lastly import path from path. Okay? So again, the fs will read the file. It's basically file stream. That's what it stands for. And then the path is the path to the file. It's very similar in Python, I believe. Okay. All right. So now let's define finally our API route handler. So we're going to say export async, because this is going to be an asynchronous function. And the way that the route handler works is that in Next.js 13 plus or 13 and above, instead of defining, for example, a function like send mail, like this, instead of a named function, you would leverage the actual method type. So you would say post or get or put, whatever the type is. In this case, we want to post data or we want to send data to the server in order to get data back. So we're going to use the post. And we're going to say that this post takes in a request, and this request is what's going to be coming from our homepage. If you guys recall, we called the API/contact us endpoint, and that request object is coming from there basically. And that's going to be our form data. So I'm going to hit enter on that, curly braces. Now what we'll do is we're going to grab our data. So we're going to say const data, and we're going to say await, and we can use await because we're using async, request.json, semicolon. All right, and that's going to give us our JSON, our form data as JSON. Okay. Next, we need to, let's see, I'm going to add some comments here. I'm going to say get HTML template, so you guys will know exactly what this does. So now we need to fetch the actual raw HTML. So we're going to say, actually, you know what? We're probably going to need to update that along the way. So I'm going to use a let instead of a const. And a let will allow me to modify this value. So I'm going to say let HTML content. And we're going to set that equal to, you know what? Let's just set that to null for now, because what I want to do before that is I want to set the path. So let's do this. The path could be const HTML file path, and we're going to set that equal to path, and the path namespace has a .join function. So path.join semicolon at the end. And in here, what we'll do is we'll pass in our process. There's that process again, but we're not going to use an environment variable here. We're going to say process.cwd. Okay? And this function is basically the working directory, right? The current working directories. That's what that stands for. So whatever the current working directory is basically the root of this file path. comma, and we're just going to specify a string of emails because that's the name of the folder that we created in which we house the template file, the HTML file, another comma, and then we're going to specify another string which will be the name of the file. So it's going to be contact form.html, and that's going to give us the file path. And then right after that, down here, we can get rid of this null now, because now we can grab the content now that we have the file path. So we're going to say that's going to be equal to fs for file stream. Let's just make some space here. It's going to get a little jumbled up. Say file stream dot read file. Read file. Oops, not sure what happened there. Read file. And just add a semicolon. Now this read file actually takes in some parameters, but you know what? Now that I think about it, read file returns an asynchronous response, but what I want to happen is I want this to come back synchronously instead, because I want I want the application to wait until the HTML is returned. So that way I know for certain we have the HTML available and we don't have to use a lot of promise chains to get that. So I'm just going to run this as read file sync. So this is going to now call this synchronously, so that way we wait until the HTML template is returned to this caller. Hopefully that makes sense to you folks. Now we're going to pass in the HTML file path as the first parameter, comma. What we need to pass in now is the encoding type. So that's going to be a string of UTF-8 like that, comma. And now we'll need to pass in an object. So first we're going to define, this is going to be a callback function. Okay, so we're going to define first our parameters. We're going to have an error object in the event that there is an error, and then we're going to have the actual HTML content. And this is going to be an arrow function, which is a callback. So I'll add the curly braces and the arrow, hit enter. And let's see. I want to first handle the error. So I'm going to say if error, or if error. If we have an error, we're just going to say console.error. And in this error, we're going to say error, say that 5 times fast, reading HTML file. And then comma, and then we're going to pass the error object like that. Yeah, perfect. Okay, I'll just Command S to save that. Actually, what I'll do also is I'm just going to add a return statement here to automatically exit this function. It'll basically exit the function early if there's an error, so that way we don't continue processing. All right. So now outside of this, let's just make some space here. Outside of this function is where we want to set the HTML content that's being returned. So I'm just going to add some comments. I'm going to say here, replace merge tags with values, because this is the step where we do that. We're going to say HTML content. We're going to set that equal to replace merge tags. That's the function that we're bringing in, the one that we defined just shortly ago. And we're going to pass in the data that we're getting as part of this request. And then what we need to do is pass the actual HTML content as the string to manipulate. All right, so that's going to be passed to that method. That method or function is going to handle its business. And then what we'll do is we'll need to also define our plain text version of this. So we're going to define a new const. We're going to say plain text content. And we're going to set that equal to strip HTML tags. That's the other function. And this function takes in just the HTML content. Right, and that's basically going to strip out those additional tags and convert that to plain text for us. So that way we don't have to define a separate template. Cool, so that's pretty heavy stuff. So I think that what we'll do next here, we now have to send the email, okay? So we have to do that. So let me just add some comments. I'm going to say send email. So I'm going to have a try-catch block to handle things gracefully in the event that there is an error. So we're going to say try catch, And let's see. I think what we'll do here is, now in the common scenario is when you send this email, I'll just call this error, just open that up. When you send this email normally, you would have some sort of log file, or you would have like a database table to capture any error messages. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm not going to build that out. I'm just going to display in a console.error again. And here we're going to say, actually, you know what? Let's just display the error. We don't have to do anything special. And forgot my semicolon. And immediately we're going to return. There we go. We're going to immediately return a next response, as that's what we brought in above, and we're going to return the JSON. And in here, what this is the first time we're using this. What this function takes in is an object. It could take actually multiple objects, but the first one is usually the data that you want to return back to the caller. So we're going to say here error. All right, because this is going to be the data we're going to send back. We're going to say error, and we're just going to send back a string. We're going to say error.message, like that. Now the second argument is optional, but I like to send it back just in case. I'm just going to say here comma outside of this object and create another object, and that's going to be the status. And the status that we'll send back will be error.status. And that's generally going to be the status code, which is a number type. So for example, it could be a 404 error, it could be a 500 server error, it could be an unauthorized 401 if we have the wrong password, for example. It could be anything, right? You can actually define your own, you can set it explicitly, you can do different things. All right, so within the try part, which is the meat and potatoes of this, what we need to do is work with our transporter. So we're going to say await here, and we're going to say await transporter dot, and there is a send mail. You see I have the auto suggest here, send mail function. I'm going to add this semicolon here, and this function takes in an options object like that, curly braces, and I'll hit enter. And there's a few attributes we'll need to define. The first thing we need to do is we need to spread across the from and to attributes from our mail options, which is a part of our client.js file. So we're going to say ... to spread it, mail options. The alternative is we could have defined it here, but since we have that as in our client.js, we can just spread that across. But that is mandatory, it's required. Okay, and the second thing here, we have a subject that it takes in, and we're just going to say new contact inquiry. Yep. The third thing is it takes in a text, which is the body. Now for the text, it actually takes in a text and an HTML. For the text one, we want to pass the plain text content, right? And for the HTML one, we want to pass in the HTML content, right? So that way, again, how that works is essentially if the user's browser or app allows HTML formatting in emails, it'll display as a preferred option the HTML version of it. Otherwise, it will default to the text version, hence why we needed to strip out the HTML tags so that way we don't have any garbled text in our email body. All right? So I think that's it for that part here. Actually, what we want to do as the last thing here is we want to return a result, right? So we're going to say return next response, also passing in here in the .json function an actual object. So we're going to make that nice and simple. We're just going to pass an object with a success attribute, and we're just going to set that to true and add a semicolon here. And I think, guys, that should do it for this file. Just trying to think, is there something else we need to add? No, I think that should be it. So let's flip back to our browser, and We may need to do a refresh. It normally hot reloads, but I'm just going to do a hard refresh here. All right, cool. So let's test this thing out, guys. Let's go ahead and populate this form. And we're going to say test@example.com. And the message, testing out this form. And what I'm going to do is, let's add some space here just to show you guys something. Testing out this form, and here is some more input, like that. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to click send message here, and let's see what we get back. All right, so we got here, your inquiry has been submitted. So that obviously means that we don't have any error messages. So I'm going to click OK here. If I go here, you guys will see we have this email. So this is working. Again, the subject line here is new contact inquiry. And then we have this email coming in with my information. And if you guys recall, what we did for messages, we actually added some new lines. But what happened here is it put it all in one line, and that's because when you submit this information, it's not reading the new lines properly. So as a homework assignment, because I won't show it in this video, you guys should try to figure out how to put the text input on different lines. As a hint, there are plugins that can do this, but also you can leverage a little bit of code to just know exactly where to cut off. You may have to insert something like new line characters in some areas, but you guys can figure that out for homework. And that's pretty much how you work with Node Mailer, guys. It's pretty simple. You know, again, all we simply did here, going back to our code, is we just set up our client. If I open up client.js, we just basically set up our client here using the Node package, Node Mailer package, and basically it did all of the hard work for us. We just had to set up our configuration object and then called that within our API route here, route.js, right here, using this post method, and then we just handled that request here and then pass that back to the caller. So that's pretty much it, guys. That wraps up this video. If you guys haven't done so already, hit the like button on this and subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell icon to stay notified on future videos. And again, make sure you subscribe or join my Discord server, because I'll definitely be posting some content on there as we go along. But also, you guys could feel free to post any code-related content that you guys would like to talk about, and I'll definitely be on there and chatting it up with you guys. So, you know, with that being said, guys, thank you once again for watching this video and following along. And until next time, happy coding.